is Debbie Foster. She is a Habitat Steward, an ambassador, and host with the National Wildlife Federation, a founding member of HAWK, a Central Carolinas Master Naturalist, a Mecklenburg County Master Composter. Didn't even know that they had those. That's awesome. An Audubon Ambassador, and holds a certificate in Native Plant Studies from UNCC.
Thank you for having me tonight, and congratulations on the formation of your new chapter. It's always really, really exciting to see people of like minds and values coming together. So we're going to talk about creating wildlife habitats tonight, and you may very well know some of this information, but I will try to share some perspectives that I have after years of doing this, because we've learned a lot over the last few years. So one of the things that people might want to know is, well, why should I do this? Why do I want to do this? And the reason is, think about how much environmental legislation we have lost in the last 4 years. I read something that said basically we have rolled back to the 1960s. We potentially have Arctic drilling going on. So we need to do something to help the wildlife that we have, try to sustain the wildlife that we have. If you haven't read the climate change document that was based on research by Audubon, you need to do it. It is stunning, and not in a good way. It talks about how many of our bird species we are likely to lose, and that there's nothing we can do about it. They're probably past the point of no return at this point. But it does have a helpful message too, and that is, we can still control some of this. We can try to limit the temperature change, the climate change, and that will help some of our birds. And I think another perspective is we ask, what can I do as an individual? What can my neighborhood do? What can my school do? What can a group that I belong to do? And the answer is, yeah, you can do something. One of the things that you can do is you can create your own wildlife habitat, regardless of where it is. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. And just to give you a frame of reference, almost all of these are in my yard, and these were not present before I created a wildlife habitat in my yard. So I've very deliberately drawn things into my yard. Lazy squirrels that hang out on the front porch, for example. Bee balm is fabulous for pollinators. This is our native honeysuckle on the top left, if you've never seen that. The bloom in the middle is from a dwarf Fothergilla plant, which I think is just gorgeous. And then, of course, we have some black swallowtails on parsley on the right. And this cheeky guy in the middle sits on my bird feeder system from time to time. Needless to say, I don't see any bird feeders or birds feeding on it when he's out there. And my parrot screams bloody murder when he sees him out there, too. And then we had another visitor to the front porch. Apparently my front porch is a happening area, with this black rat snake who was out there. And he was just awesome. He was about 4 feet long. And then the one on the right, a bunch of cedar waxwings. I had never seen cedar waxwings in my yard before, but they've come for the last 4 or 5 years now. And I just think they're amazing creatures. And then when we put in a wildlife habitat at Central Piedmont's Levine campus, this is what we ended up with. We had killdeer on the site, and I ran in because I found the nest, stumbled on it by accident because, you know, they put their eggs flat on the ground. They look a lot like pebbles or rocks. They don't build a nest at all. And had it not been for the adult bird pretending that he was hurt, pitifully dragging a wing and running away and screaming, killdeer, killdeer, the whole time, I probably would not have seen the nest. I went into the security office of the campus and asked for cones to put around the nest so that the mowers would not mow straight over the nest. And when I asked the head of security for cones because there was a killdeer site, it was kind of like a skit from Mayberry. He's yelling, who killed a deer? Who killed a deer? I'm like, no. A killdeer is a bird. So everybody on campus got educated about killdeer after that. Okay, go ahead, Tara. So there are a number of requirements. Just keep forwarding it. I think it helps to know, there you go. I just checked, these stats are accurate as of less than a year ago, and they were provided by National Wildlife Federation. So we now have over 228,000 certified wildlife habitats in the United States. To give you a frame of reference, when I did mine about 16, 17 years ago, my number is 44,039. So this shows some serious progress in the United States, and I think that's got to be a hopeful thing. And then in North Carolina, we now have over 10,000. That's a great thing to see as well. Charlotte, and Ernie wanted me to point out, Charlotte is frequently talked about as a happening place for wildlife and habitats in the country. They're over 1,300. Couldn't get the most current stats for Matthews, but I know they were over about 330 several years ago when I checked. So I would think that they've continued to grow. Okay. So we have, and this list is not actually up to date. I think there are about 12 maybe community wildlife habitat programs in the state of North Carolina now. So again, it's showing some value. And when I speak to legislators, I bring up stuff like this. I want them to know that I represent a group of people who value wildlife, who value conservation, who value the environment, and who are likely to vote according to our values. So it's really good that they know these things. I think there are 65,000 Audubon members in the state of North Carolina, and I will tell you, when you go to the legislature and you mention that little fact, their heads snap. They start to listen at that point because that represents a potential voting block. Okay. Yep, it's Charlotte and Concord. There comes some more. Okay, Nashville. Yeah, and I don't know, I can't remember what the new ones are that have been added most recently, but you get an idea. We see a trend here. We're moving in the right direction. So why should you care? Again, we're part of the same thing. This statistic was, when I first started this maybe 15 years ago, you saw this every time anybody gave a presentation, that Charlotte lost 41 acres a day to construction. And we know that Charlotte's tree canopy is down to, I think the last figure I saw was a week or two ago, and I think they said 42%. So that's kind of hard. There's the 49% at that point. And it's not just the trees. It's going to raise the temperature. It's affecting stormwater runoff and the removal of pollutants and air quality for residents. So this is not something that's somebody else's problem, that somebody else will be bothered by. It's an equal opportunity problem for all of us. Our kids, when I was a kid and in school, we never heard the term attention deficit disorder. We did not identify as children as hyperactive. And I can't help but wonder if it was because we were outside. You know, we went outside and we played. We weren't sitting inside exercising like this on some sort of a device and staring at a screen. My mother, I always joke and said, she said, get out. And people would go, yeah, my mother did that. And she said, and you better be home by dark. I said, yeah, I don't think mine said that. I'm the oldest of 6 kids, so she was more than willing to have us go play outside and stay there. Wildlife's losing its habitat, so we see things we never saw before. 15 years ago, you heard very little about coyotes in this area, but you sure hear about them now. We know that they're in every county in North Carolina, okay? And when we have a problem, when we break that food chain, it can collapse in on itself. And you know, we don't always know what the environmental contribution of different organisms are. Sometimes we find out when it's way too late after they're gone. So we want to look at that whole food chain and protect it overall. So the bottom line is it's way too expensive for us to continue to lose this. We're losing money, certainly. We're having the environment decimated. Our health suffers. I think a really good example is what happened when the pandemic got really bad. What happened when all those cars came off the road? What happened in the city of San Francisco, okay, where all of a sudden our air quality radically improved because there weren't so many cars on the road. All right, so it's just we're not past the point of no return, but we do have to be proactive about it. We're losing plants, we're losing animals. So we're talking about today, but we're also talking about the costs that this is going to take in the future, okay? It's just too high, okay? Go ahead. So where can they be created? Pretty much anywhere. And it was a hard thing for me to wrap my head around when I first started doing this, because people would say, well, I live in an apartment. And I would think, oh, I'm sorry, I just don't have any ideas for how you can create a habitat in an apartment. Well, we've learned that since then. So regardless of where you live, whether you own it, whether it's in a controlled situation with an HOA, there are always ways you can create a wildlife habitat. Even if it's a little patio home, if it's got a balcony, you can still create something there. Any place of worship. And I think it makes sense from my perspective that one of the organizations that should be protecting creation is those people who worship the Creator. I mean, that's just kind of common sense. So that's one of the arguments that I've used when I speak to parishes about this. And, you know, North Carolina Wildlife Federation has a special designation for places of worship called FAITH, which stands for Fellowship Actions Impacting the Habitat. And I don't know how many of those there are at this point. There were half a dozen or so last time I checked. Businesses, this is a great thing for a business owner to do and to promote, because let's face it, why does anybody want to argue against this? So if you can say, hey, I represent the smallest business in Charlotte that has a certified wildlife habitat. Those are bragging rights. I represent an apartment complex that is certified as a wildlife habitat. I spoke to a developer this week and said, okay, you know, we know you're going to take out some trees when you're doing this, but let's talk about some options here. Let's talk about how you can do some good instead of just decimating the environment. And of course, schools. What better place to teach kids the value of wildlife than to bring it in? Put bird feeders out in front of a classroom and let those kids learn about the birds that come in the area. And with inner city kids, sometimes they don't have the chance to walk around out in public wherever they live. So when I did a habitat at Thomasboro Elementary School, which I used to have 100% poverty level. They had a lot of kids living in cars at that point in time. And there were some kids that came out to help us when we were installing everything. And this little girl asked me what we were doing. And I said, we're putting up some bird feeders. And she stopped and she looked at me and she said, do you mean we're going to see birds here? And I said, oh, honey, I hope so. That's our dream. We want to see birds here. Absolutely. Okay. So we do these designations for special habitats, for special developments, and you can look into these on your own because I want to get to the meat and potatoes of the presentation, and that's how you go about doing this, okay? So all wildlife habitats have the same requirements: food, water, cover, places to raise young, and sustainable gardening practices. But there are different ways you can provide this, okay? When we first started doing this years ago, we always talked about providing man-made elements. So for example, instead of putting native plants in, we would talk about using bird feeders, okay? Instead of using a stream, a puddle in the yard, a pond on the site, we talk about putting in a bird bath, but it doesn't have to be that way. It can be either or both. And I never want to have just a single element of each of these requirements. Craig Wyant, who was an incredible man who died last year, did something at a Habitat Steward training that I've never forgotten. It's been at least 16, 20 years ago now. And he said when he creates a wildlife habitat, he looks high, low, and in the middle. He literally gets on his belly on the ground to see what the view is from there, what's living there that he can see, and how he can enhance the wildlife habitat for that. And then he works his way up. And so that's a different idea that I've implemented since then, because I thought it just made so much sense. I think people look at the trees and the bushes and then they never look at anything underneath them, but there all kinds of things live underneath them. Okay. So let's get going and see what we can do here. So you got to ask some questions. You have to take inventory, okay? So start by asking, what do you have, okay? And specifically, what kind of trees do you have? Shrubs, grass, ground cover, okay? Make a list of those things and make a list of what is native and what is non-native. And of those non-native species, ask yourself, what are invasive species? And if you're not sure, go on ncwildflower.org. That is the Native Plant Society chapter, Charlotte chapter's page, and they've got lists. They've got ways of identifying native plants, and then they also have a list of invasive plants. It's things that are really problematic in our area. And then what do you have in terms of food? You do have nectar. Almost every plant would produce some sort of nectar. Seeds, berries, nuts, pollen, okay? Somebody's going to have these in their yard. Maybe not 100%, maybe not nuts, but all these other things are likely to be present. And then what kind of colors and shapes and sizes do you have? And why would we ask that? Because we know that certain animals, birds, have a preference for color, shapes, or sizes. Hummingbirds are a specialist species when you think about it, because they've got that long bill that's meant to be inserted in tube-shaped flowers. And we know that they have a preference for red and yellow. So that helps us identify what native plants we might want to put in. Size is important too, and this is something else I've changed over the years. So I always want to have a huge variety of layers in my yard. I want to have some ground cover. I want to have some, something up to say maybe 3 feet tall, different types of plants. I want to have something in the 5, 6, 7, 8 foot range, and I want to have something above that, because these animals that we want to attract to our yard have different requirements and different tastes, different values, if you will. So by putting these layers in, we're providing food, we're providing cover, we're providing places to raise young, okay? We're putting a lot of the wildlife requirements in there. But I think it's also important to ask yourself, is there something you don't want? And sadly, that's kind of the way I started out doing this years ago. I went to the local bird store and said, I really want to put up a bird feeder, but I don't have a clue what to do. So you tell me. And he asked, is there anything you don't want? And I said, yep, I do not want squirrels. I lived in Georgia. They got in our house. They really like it inside. They like heating and air conditioning. So it was really hard to get them out, and they did a huge amount of damage and darn near set the house on fire. So I did not want to feed squirrels. So he said, okay, well, let's start with safflower seed then, because that's not something that squirrels prefer. If an animal's hungry, it will eat anything like a person will, but they don't naturally gravitate toward safflower seed. Cardinals, however, love safflower seeds. So that was wonderful to see all these cardinals come into my yard. What I didn't know at the time is the neighbors had Leland cypress as a border, and so that certainly helped with the cardinals in the yard too. But asking what I didn't want was a way to get me started. So that's not a bad thing, because we can always educate about that, okay? Ask it, are you going to feed them, but is it going to be natural or provided? So do you have a place to put a bird feeder system? What do you want to put there? And you have to think about, especially in public places, the budget. Do you have the budget to continually buy seed? And do you have the staff to fill those feeders? Because that's where things can break down. Birds are like anybody else. Location's really important to them, and so we have to think about the location of their wildlife habitat. And when people come to me and they say, I've had a bluebird house out for 8 years and I've never gotten bluebirds, the first thing I ask is, where's the house? How high is it? Which direction does it face? What is in front of and behind the house? How big is the hole? I ask all of those things so we can start to narrow down whether or not it's appropriate for the species they're trying to attract, okay? All right, so feeders versus plants. And again, this is where I'm changing over the years. So there's bonuses to both of them. Feeders have to be refilled, and they're specific feeders that have specific food. It's not a one-size-fits-all thing. If you put sunflower chips in a big hopper with a very large port, they're just going to pour out onto the ground. If you put sunflower hearts in a feeder that's meant for thistle, little tiny seeds, the birds can't even get them out because they're too big to go through the hole. So you've got to know what kind of feeder you want for the type of seed you intend to feed. And a lot of people will skip the cleaning step, and that is not a good idea. You can see mold developing in some cases on the, especially thistle, and sometimes sunflower chips or heart, or the little chips. So you need to make sure that you do that. The good news is they're making feeders differently now. They're starting to redesign the feeders, and they are so much easier to clean than they used to be. And the cool thing is they're also, these easy to clean feeders have a lifetime warranty. Who doesn't love that? You may need to replace parts at some point. I lost a suet feeder, and I looked for 6 months. It was hanging from a pole, and then it wasn't hanging from a pole. And when I was working in a shade garden in my yard 6 months later, in the hammock was my suet feeder. So my guess is that a raccoon took it down from the feeder system and decided to get comfy while he was eating the suet in it. So it can be expensive, but if you buy the lifetime warranty feeder, that's the way to go here. Now, plants are going to give you some joy to look at. They provide aesthetic value for your yard, and then they also can provide other types of value. So they can provide the food, they can be a beautiful part of your landscaping. If you want to see an interesting example of a native plant garden, go to Morning Star Lutheran, which is a really tiny, I don't know, 150-year-old church off of Idlewild. And Lisa Tompkins, who's been the president of the Charlotte Native Plant Chapter for a lot of years now, designed that. It is gorgeous. It is absolutely gorgeous, and it has all the elements we've talked about. It's got all those wonderful layers too. It's got texture. It's got color. It's got evergreens. It's just absolutely amazing, and it's part of a project that included a labyrinth, which was a memorial project for someone who died. And so you can see the labyrinth. They've got chimes hanging in the trees. It's just the most beautiful setting, very peaceful. It can also save you money, because if you put those plants in the right places around your house, you're going to save on your utility bills because it's going to provide shade. And then it provides part of the wildlife elements, shelter in places to raise young. Now, people will argue and say, I'm not planting blueberries. All the birds do is eat the blueberries. So my advice is plant more blueberries. Plant enough that there's some for you and some for them, because there is a saturation point there. You can cover half of them with a net if you like. Some people advise putting a fake snake in the blueberry bushes to perhaps deter the birds. I guess it depends on how smart your birds are in the area as to whether or not it works. Okay. And I wanted to give you, this is just from my perspective based on experience, but also there's a wonderful Audubon handout that's a trifold, and it's on the recommendation for native plants, and some of these came from this. So Rudbeckia is a workhorse in the garden. It's commonly known as black-eyed Susan, and there are different types of Rudbeckia. So if you have a large area to cover, some of them spread very, very quickly. So that's a nice way to fill up a space. And I have seen these bloom not quite year round, but darn close. So I've seen them bloom well into October, and they start blooming in May. And this is an example of Rudbeckia right here. And there's a goldfinch or two on it somewhere. There's one right there. But the seed heads form seeds that ripen at the exact same time that the goldfinches come off the nest. And goldfinches are one of the few birds that don't feed their babies insects. They feed their baby seeds. So it's a symbiotic relationship for this plant ripening its seeds in time for the goldfinches to come off of it. And then cardinal flowers, gorgeous. This is something that's usually better around stream banks in a wetter area and in a shady spot, but I have seen it grow in some sun. Beautiful red flower, great pollinator plant, also attracts hummingbirds. It's, I think they call it a biennial because technically it lives about 2 years. So it is something that has to be replaced more periodically, more frequently. And then coral honeysuckle you saw in that opening slide. And I don't know why anybody would want Japanese honeysuckle if you can have coral honeysuckle instead. It is gorgeous. It is a very hardy vine. I have mine on a trellis, and it's pretty much covered up the trellis. And I have literally in 2 different locations that I've done wildlife habitat seen this bloom year round. It's blooming right now at my church. Absolutely amazing. Purple cone flowers, another standard. They're tweaking the colors of coneflower a lot, and I don't know that all of these designer coneflowers have the same appeal to wildlife as the basic purple coneflower does. So I would probably default to that. It may be hardier as well, so I would check with that. Blueberries are great, and keep in mind, blueberries come in a lot of different sizes. So you can get a dwarf blueberry that is no more than 3 feet tall. And then you can get some that are about 12 feet tall. You can get blueberries that are early, mid, and late summer bloomers. So if you do it right, you could have blueberries blooming for a good portion of the year to feed you and the wildlife. And people never think about herbs as something for a wildlife habitat. But parsley, fennel, and dill are all 3 host plants. And I have seen people get so upset because something ate their parsley right down to the stem. It ate my parsley right down to the stem. And I'm like, that is great. You've got swallowtails. And at church, the people go, do you want me to pick those off? I'm like, nope, let's talk. Okay, so you're providing something. If you're worried about having parsley for cooking, plant more parsley. Okay, but this is great to see the cycle of life on these things. And then milkweed, of course, is something that the monarchs require. And ideally, you should plant different types of milkweed. You should have certainly butterfly weed, which is Asclepias tuberosa, and you should have a common milkweed. And we'll talk about using native plants for food and how wildlife recognize native plants as opposed to exotic plants, okay? So think it through before you plant. You know, if you plant a plant that is very, very needy of water, and you plant it in dry conditions, that plant's not going to survive. And the opposite is true too. If the plant needs water or if the plant doesn't want wet feet and you plant it and water the heck out of it, then you're going to have a problem. So understand ahead of time what those plants that you want require. Talk to somebody that understands what the requirements are of the plant. And I would not necessarily go to a big box store to do that. That would be my personal choice because I've gotten some really bad information when I've asked questions. So I'm thinking there are better choices there, like the Native Plant Society. Just as there are water needs, there are also light needs. Dr. Melichamp from the UNCC Botanical Gardens, he was the head there for 38 years, said that when it says full sun on a plant tag, it does not mean full afternoon sun in the south, because almost everything needs protection from full afternoon sun in the south. So think that through too. Soil type. Native plants are meant to grow in native soil, so there's a nice relationship there. So we can cuss our clay as much as we want to, but it is our native soil, and therefore our plants are meant to grow in the native soil. Now, if it is hardened like adobe or concrete, yeah, you're going to have to break it up and maybe add some mulch to it or compost to it before you start planting. But otherwise, don't worry about it as much. And the cool thing about using native plants as and part of your wildlife habitat is you don't go out there and snip off spent heads, which drives my gardeners at church absolutely insane. I've got a couple of them who are retired military and they really want to go out there and deadhead. And I'm like, we don't deadhead here. We leave it. We leave those seed heads to ripen because it's beneficial to wildlife. And I try so hard to catch when we've got 3 dozen goldfinches on those Rudbeckia so that they can see 3 different goldfinches soar up into the sky at the same time, because then they go, oh, that's why we do this. Well, that's pretty cool. And then they also see why we don't use pesticides in our garden, because we would be killing the things we're trying to attract. Okay? Mother Nature there. All right, so water is the first need of everything. We can live longer without food than we can without water, but there are so many ways of providing water. So a bird bath is a simple way, and bird baths probably start at $20 and go up to however much you want to spend. If you want to get a great big fountain with a bird bath, you can spend thousands of dollars. But what you need is a container that holds water, and that is easy to clean. So it could be a bird bath, but it could also be something as simple as the bottom to a flower pot, the reservoir to a pot that catches the water when you water it. that's technically a container that has water. Ponds, streams, lakes, even swampy areas of your yard will work. I love adding accessories to my bird baths, and the two that I like most are drippers and misters, and frequently those are combined into one thing. And this is it, that tube that you see, okay, that's the dripper mister. And the cool thing about this is you can set it on a timer to go off at, say, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and it emits a very fine spray that you can actually either choose the spray or choose a drip, and the drip can be really slow, like drip, drip, or I will also set it faster and fill up my bird bath because I like to avoid work if I can. So those are great things, but the birds will actually almost learn to tell time and will come in. And you know, birds are attracted by the sound of running water. So this is a wonderful benefit, a great accessory. And that other thing you see under the rock, that is a heater, and it comes on when it hits below freezing, and I don't have to worry about going out there and dumping out a frozen bird bath, and because you know birds can't drink frozen water, so we want to make sure they still have fresh, clean water even in really cold weather. And then you can create your own puddling area. If you've got a spot in your yard that's already kind of swampy, that's great. If not, you can just dig a shallow depression. You can fill it with cow manure and sand. The muckier the better, and the butterflies can use it as a puddling area, and they use it to get minerals from the soil. And then birds can use it as well, because not everything bathes up high. Some birds bathe by rubbing against leaves. Some animals drink from the ground. So by giving these layers, you're going to get more and more animals in your yard. Okay. And then again, has to be fresh. So mosquitoes are a big concern for people, right? And we have to understand what our responsibility is in the mosquito life cycle. So what we can do here is we can simply dump the water out after about 3 days, because the mosquitoes hatch in about 4. So that works. That's one thing we can do. Another thing we can do is we can deliberately work at attracting bluebirds, especially, to our yard. Bluebirds are tremendous consumers of mosquitoes. So and remember that birds, with the exception of goldfinches, feed their babies protein sources in the form of insects. So if you have a lot of the birds in your yard, you're not going to have as many of the insects. You can actually watch them flying into the boxes with their beaks stuffed full of insects. Okay. And then shelter. It's a place to escape predators. So think about having a beautiful dinner. Somebody has given you a surf and turf dinner with the finest bottle of champagne it's possible to get, and it's free. Yay, right? Bring it on. But it's over there by the sewage treatment plant at 45, and I think it's Ray Road, okay? Now it's not quite so appealing, right? So we have to think about location and shelter. So what are we trying to provide shelter for in our yard? So we might want to leave the leaves, for example, rather than raking those leaves up from under the bushes religiously every year and putting them in plastic bags and putting them in the street, which is another conversation to have. How about leaving them under the bushes? How about not even worrying about raking them up so much so that we don't disturb what's already there that we won't even see, most likely? Leaving snags. Oh my gosh, I had a dead dogwood tree in my yard for years, and it finally, the last piece fell down this year. I got to watch 2 nuthatches excavate a nest site in that last year, and I got to watch them feed their babies, and that was worth hours of entertainment for me. I have all kinds of pictures of the family and the whole process, and I wouldn't have traded that for anything. My husband has spent years going, when are we cutting that tree down? I'm like, stand here and watch for a minute. See how many birds come to this tree. Watch the woodpeckers. Watch the nuthatches. We don't want to cut this tree down. It's not going to fall in the house. It's not hurting a thing. I have a small pond in my yard, and literally I put the pond in and started seeing dragonflies the next day. I couldn't believe it. I'd never seen a dragonfly in my yard before. And I have a variety of frogs that I hear singing in the spring. So I'm really trying to encourage things on a lot of levels by providing shelter as well. Okay. And again, like Craig Wyant said, it's about perspective. Look high, low, and in the middle, because something lives in every elevation in your yard. And once you figure that out, you can start to see the whole life cycle. You can start to see this whole chain developing, and it's a lovely thing to see. Okay. And shelter, again, natural versus man-made. If you've got trees, shrubs, bushes, plants, rocks, brush pile, those are all elements of shelter. The man-made elements are different types of houses, like bat houses and bird houses. Firefly houses may or may not be used. I don't ever worry about those too much. Toad abodes give these soft-skinned creatures a chance to get in out of our very cruel sun and get a little shade and perhaps have a little moisture level in there. If you're going to put up a house, make sure you understand the requirements for that particular species that you're trying to attract. So bat houses have to be up. I think it's a minimum of 30 feet. So you may need some help getting that up. And the same with owl houses. You may find that it takes a long time to attract what you want. There's a guy that's on the Greenway in Matthews, and he is a wildlife biologist, so he certainly knew what all the requirements were. But he put up a bat house, and it took him, not a bat house, an owl house. It took him 8 years before he had his first owls in the house. And luckily, he's had 2 sets now, and the parents have already been checking out the house for this year. So I think we're going to have 3. And it's so cool to see people on the Greenway going, oh my God, did you see an owl? Like, I mean, they just don't even realize they're out there, but these are right there where you can see them. So check out the requirements. Talk to somebody that's knowledgeable about what's required, what material things should be made out of, how big the opening should be, how to clean it out, making sure that it's accessible for a clean out if need be. And then think about what's the symmetry in your yard going to be. So I love owls. They're one of my very favorite birds. My yard is not quite a 1/4 of an acre. And I'm thinking, I'm not sure that I'm willing to kind of sacrifice all of my songbird population to get the owls in. So I'm willing to walk on the Greenway in Matthews and in the parks and watch the owls there. I've decided, and then we see some in the neighborhood, but I don't think that my yard is the right habitat for them. Okay. And places to raise young can be the same thing as shelter. You know, when it comes right down to it, not everything uses a birdhouse. You're not going to see cardinals or robins in a birdhouse. No, they don't use birdhouses. So you have to understand what this species is likely to, how it would build, where it would build, and go from there. When I taught a Habitat Steward training class many years back, we were working on a habitat at Union County Hospice. And one of my newly ordained Habitat Stewards came to help, and she was in tears. And I said, what is wrong? And she said, something got all my baby birds last night. They're all gone. And I'm like, oh no, what happened? And she said, I don't know. And I said, well, they were there yesterday evening. Yeah, now they're just gone. And I said, well, but how'd they get past the baffle? And she said, oh, I don't have a baffle. Well, you know, there's a really good chance if you don't have a baffle, and there are 2 different examples in the pictures, that a black snake or a raccoon, those are the 2 most common, are probably going to predate the babies and potentially the adults too. So if you want to give them a chance to at least fledge, then you might want to put up a baffle, or you might want to put up a lot of houses and let nature take its course. It's a personal choice there. Just kind of see what you're comfortable with. I saw a chickadee last year doing something I'd never seen a chickadee doing, and it was hovering. It looked like a hummingbird the way that it was hovering, and I didn't even know they did that. And vocalizing loudly, and it was right at the opening to a feeder that the bluebirds had used, not a feeder, a house that the bluebirds had used this past year. And I thought, well, what is going on? Are there bluebirds in the house already? Because it hadn't been very long since they had fledged, and why is this chickadee so agitated about it? And then I saw something stick its head out of the house, and I thought, well, that's not a bluebird. And somehow or another, a black rat snake had gotten past the baffle and was in the house. And apparently, I talked to a person that did research at Cornell, and this is a pretty common thing. And so this snake was trying to strike at the chickadee, who was alerting everybody in the neighborhood to danger in the house. And I opened the side of the house and got a stick and just got the snake out and put him on the ground, and everybody was fine after that. But it was really interesting to watch, and that's another benefit to having a wildlife habitat. Okay. And sustainable gardening practices. It interests me that this was part of the requirements years ago, and then people at NWF had a big discussion, and they decided it might have been maybe too much to ask of people, so they took it out for a while, and then they put it back in. So what I tell people is I just call this the common sense approach, okay? If you are working really hard at attracting birds and butterflies and bees and dragonflies and toads to your yard, and you deliberately or thoughtlessly maybe use something that can kill those things or kill what those things eat, okay, you're pretty much shooting yourself in the foot there. So I am very, very cautious about what I use in my yard. My personal choice is I don't use chemicals. I don't like what I hear about Roundup. I think they've banned it in the European Union, so I don't see why I would want to use that in my yard. And I think you also have to look at something that's not really new, but it's really new to the public view, I think. And that's the use of neonicotinoids, or neonics for short. And it's a tobacco-based product. And what they're doing is they're treating plants with it at the nursery level, and to discourage things from chewing on the leaves, because, you know, we all want pristine plants that, you know, we don't even want to see a piece of parsley chewed by a larva for butterflies. So when we use these neonicotinoids, right now they really don't know how long they last in the soil. Could be decades. Who knows? We don't have that information at this point. So I am careful about where I get my plants from. If I go to a big box store, I would say there's virtually 100% chance that these plants have been treated with neonics. So I'm going to look for other sources for my plants, especially those pollinator plants. It doesn't make sense to pull it in and kill it. So just that's my public service announcement there. Okay. And then once you have all of these elements, you are ready to go. So you can certify. There's the address to certify. There's a lot of on NWF's webpage, ton of different ways to get to this, and a ton of bits of information for you on certifying and on providing those different elements as well. I know that there's been some discussion about having Habitat Steward training again in the area. And the cool thing about being a Habitat Steward is you can get some free handouts from NWF. So you can get handouts on amphibian decline and choosing the right birdhouse and lawn reduction and pollinator species. I mean, it's just, there's a lot of stuff that you can tap into for free. So that's a lovely benefit, okay? So you will get for your certification, and it's only $20. It's a one-time fee. People tend to think it's an annual fee. Nope, one time. And that's going to be this certificate here. And I thought it was pretty. I framed it and hung it in my living room. And on that certificate, it will have your name, your address, and your number. So you'll be able to see what you are. And we know you're going to be over 228,000 because we know we've got that many in the country. And that's pretty cool. I think it's bragging rights. And then I also encourage people to get a sign for your yard. And this sign on the top right, this is the old sign. They now have one with a raccoon, which is the mascot for NWF. But my sign is now, again, about 20 years old, and it looks brand new. So I'm really happy with having invested that $30 in this sign. And I tell people, get signs because they're passive education. When your neighbors walk by and they see this sign and you're out playing in your yard and they ask, what's that sign about? You've got a chance to educate the neighbors, okay, which is wonderful because let's face it, if I create a wildlife habitat in my yard and my next door neighbor does, and the neighbor 2 streets behind me and 2 streets over does, what we're creating is a corridor for wildlife. And that's what we're going to need to kind of make the changes we need to make. We need as many people doing this as possible because it is something we can control. Now, if you want to pay a lot of money for a sign, then you can go for the other one. And you can get even fancier ones that have your address on it. So it doesn't matter what the sign is, just make sure you get a sign so that the neighbors can see and you can start to answer questions about it and spread the word. Okay? All right. So I love this because if you talk to your neighbors, I can't tell you how many people I've talked to that now have wildlife habitats. So I'm always thrilled when they're willing to do that. And then if you're working with a public site, if you're doing a project, spread the word there too. It is so easy to get publicity. It's just a matter of sometimes writing it yourself and sending it into a neighborhood newspaper. You can put it on a neighborhood Facebook page, for example. You can put it on Nextdoor. It is so easy to spread the word that way. So make sure you get it out there so that people get it. And then if, we finally get past the point we're at now with COVID, you can hold tours. This could be a fundraiser for your chapter, for example. So people could go from one certified wildlife habitat to the other in your area and see they're not all going to look the same. Not at all. It depends on what people are trying to attract and how they want to go about doing it. So you can have them just go from house to house to house, or house to business to place of worship to school, whatever you've done there, and see what this looks like. I know that there can be some misconceptions about this. We're building a new church on a different property right now, and I did a presentation last week on the use of native grasses in order to replace copious amounts of turf grass. And in their mind, when I said native grasses, what they heard was unmowed pastures. And so I had to provide some beautiful pictures of our native grasses, our pink muley grass, our blue stem grass, so that they could see, oh, this is not what cattle would graze on. This is something different, and this is acceptable to me. So make sure that you spread the word about things like that. Keep going. Yep. And I tell you what, this was a hard lesson for me to learn. So I would work outside in my yard and work. And I always kind of had my nose to the ground or to the plant or whatever I was working with. And it finally dawned on me one day that I was missing what I had been working for. And so I started to make a point of sitting in my backyard when I would finish working and just sitting quietly and listening and watching and seeing what there was to see. Maybe having a glass of wine while I was doing it and enjoying what I had created, because we need that connection with nature. We need it more than ever right now. All right, we have there's my contact information if you need me. Bringing Nature Home is a great resource, and I will add also the Mecklenburg books. So Native Plants of the Southeast is a fabulous resource. Has fabulous pictures by Will Stewart, and it's based on Dr. Mellechamp's career, and the latest one they just published within the last 6 months had the executive, but he was the executive director, but they had the assistant director of the Botanical Gardens and Greenhouses, Paula Gross. Really good resource. Dr. Mellechamp lays it all on the line. Why is it good? Why is it bad? Why might you not want to use it? Why should you use it? And anytime I've ever been to a plant sale up at UNCC and I saw Dr. Mellechamp say, this is required, I bought it without even reading anything else. I was going to snatch that up and get it in my yard. So I would encourage you to do that too. Right now, we do have an event happening fairly soon. If you look at Mecklenburg, and not Mecklenburg County, just Mecklenburg Soil and Water Conservation District, they are having their annual tree and seedling sale in partnership with Trees Charlotte coming up. And if you tap into their recent newsletter, it came out last week, and go to pages 12, 13, and 14, I've sent this out a lot, you will see the list of plants, pictures of the plants, and they are all native. So there are trees and shrubs. And they will tell you how high they grow, what kind of soil they need, what kind of light they need, how much water they need. So they answer all those questions we should be asking, but we don't always know to ask. They're not huge. Mecklenburg Soil and Water Conservation District, and Trees Charlotte. And I mean, this is, I think they are priced at $2.25 this year. I have seen some, because I've done this for years now, I have seen some that were 4 feet tall. So I don't consider that to be a seedling necessarily. I'm really happy if I get a seedling that's 4 feet tall. I know that they've got dogwoods and redbuds, maybe fringe tree and buttonbush. I've kind of forgotten some of the list. I think there are 10 different trees and shrubs on the list this year. You do have to pre-order, so you want to find that site and go ahead and pre-order. And I think the pre-order deadline is February 19th. And then they'll have a couple of locations for you to go and pick them up from. So that's a good way of, if you've got a kind of start property that you want to get started on, or if you don't have a lot of money to get started, this is a good thing to do there. All right, do we have any questions? Wow.
So someone did ask if you could name the group, the tree group again. And that was Mecklenburg Soil and Water. Is that correct?
Mecklenburg Soil and Water Conservation District. I like your hey Paulette, and then Trees in Charlotte. And by the way, folks, you're not in Charlotte, I don't think, with your addresses, right? Anybody in Charlotte? No? If you are, okay, one. So Trees Charlotte does events multiple times a year, and it's for Charlotte residents, and so you have to provide proof of where you live. But you can get a 10 to 15 foot tree from them free. Free is good. That is my motto. I love free. So a 10 to 15 foot tree is awesome, and they include a bag of mulch with it. We were so impressed by how they do this in Matthews. I'm the chair of the Appearance and Tree Advisory Committee in Matthews, that we went to them and said, please come to Matthews. And we talked them into it. Took a couple years, but we talked them into it. And they brought their trees to Matthews and did an event. So that was awesome. And we're looking in Matthews to see how we could do an event on our own. I think they said the average cost, I've forgotten, is about 20 grand to do one of these events. So it's not insignificant, but think about being able to get that size native tree in someone's hand, teach them how to plant it when they're there picking it up, give them a bag of mulch, and you only give them one so they can't make a mulch volcano around the tree. Teach them how to care for it. And we're literally putting habitat on the ground by doing this. So if you guys ever wanted to think about, I don't know, maybe partnering with the town of Matthews about doing this, maybe we could work something out. But we'll have to find funding, and that's where we are right now. I've got the Appearance and Tree Advisory Committee people brainstorming so that we can come up with some ideas for going to people with our hands out and asking for money. We don't think we can get 20,000 from one person, but we might get 1,000 from 20. So we're just going to look at that. The name of the book on native plants was Native Plants of the Southeast. And that's the first book, and Larry Mellichamp, Mellichamp, is the author. And like I said, they have a new one that just came out, and it's some variation on that name, but I can't remember the name of that. And these books are eye candy. They're great to sit and just look at the pictures. Beautiful. You're welcome.
I had a quick question, Debbie. So it's mid-January right now, and it's a little bit cold outside, but I know we're all kind of excited to get back out and gardening. What should we be doing in our yards right now? Is there any prep that we should be doing or anything we should be thinking about to get our gardens ready for spring?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what I'd be doing is, if you have invasive plants in your yard, some examples might be English ivy, Chinese privet, autumn olive, Japanese honeysuckle. I would be pulling those out right now. I'd also, if you don't want poison ivy in your yard, this is a good time to very carefully, with good protective clothing on, pull it out as well. You can still get a rash from it right now, so be careful, but it's a good time to think about that. I know that I have wild strawberry that runs amok in my vegetable garden every year, so this is a good time for me to be working on pulling that out as well. And my bee balm likes to walk from the flower bed into the vegetable garden, so I will walk it back to where it came from, and it'll stay there another year or so, and then I'll have to do the same thing again. So that's what I'd be doing. Plant native seeds to self-stratify. Yeah, some things like milkweed has to cold stratify, so they have to go through that cold weather. We're also going to be having a milkweed sale or giveaway. We haven't made up our mind which in Matthews in probably late May or early June, and it'll be for residents. So sorry, to get more milkweed out there, and we're going to make it so easy for people to do the right thing that we're hoping that it will support the monarch population. So what is self-stratify? Cold stratify means it has to go through a winter before it's a viable plant. It has to go through a period of cold, and different plants will have different requirements, but it might be X number of days with an average of this temperature, and it'll vary. And these milkweed plants that we have being grown for us will meet those requirements, so we don't have to worry about it. There you go. Well, I'm never, ever, ever going to argue against Dr. M.
He's pretty much, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I wasn't sure. Yeah, he's pretty much become the guru, and that book of his, what I really love about it is he has a lot of comments at the end of it. At the end of each section, that'll tell you, is it good, is it bad, why not, some good cultivars, because cultivars can throw you a lot too. Some cultivars are better for wildlife and some are not. So I actually have that as literally a coffee table when I'm eating my dinner. That's what I'm going through.
That's where mine is too, is on the coffee table. And if I go on a trip, my husband likes to drive, I don't, so I'll take that book so I can just sit there and flip pages the whole time.
And every time you read it, you find something else.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Take a Post-it note, a whole pack of Post-it notes so you can stick it in the pages and go back to stuff.
Yep. I did want to ask one thing too. On one of the slides, you had that parsley, fennel, and dill were native. No. I didn't have. I did not say they were native. Oh, well, I thought the header at the top said some great native plants.
It could have been. Now that you say that, I think you're right. But yeah, they're not native. However, they are not invasive. Okay, yeah. And they are a good host plant for certain butterflies.
I actually, as a little FYI for anybody else interested, after learning that those weren't native, I looked into what was also native, and Zizia, which is Golden Alexander, is the native version of those. So it's very hard to find, but I did finally find some and put it in. So I'm hoping to get some. I still put the parsley and the fennel and dill out too, but I'm interested. So if anyone was interested, that's apparently Golden Alexander is the native version of that.
Yeah, and Golden Alexander can be obtained from Carolina Heritage Nursery, which is Lisa Tompkins' business, because I've seen her bring it to the Matthews Farmers Market multiple times, and I'm a big fan of Golden Alexander. It spreads nicely. It doesn't gallop, but it spreads nicely, and it's a really hardy plant, and that's something else I've seen blooming different times of the year that have surprised me.
Where is her nursery? Where is that, Carolina Heritage?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand you.
Where is the nursery that you just talked about that you got the Golden Alexander at?
It is in Mineral Springs, so you can find a Facebook page with Carolina Heritage Nursery, and you have to make an appointment to go out there. It's actually on her property, and she backs up to the Greenway in Mineral Springs, so it's definitely worth a trip out there, but you do want to make an appointment to go.
Okay, I'm relocated from New York. How far is Mineral Springs from here?
10 miles, 12 miles. It's not bad. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Definitely worth the trip. And she was splitting her time between the Waxhaw Farmers Market and Matthews Farmers Market, but because of the virus, she has not been doing either one of them this year.
Gotcha. I did wind up finally getting some Zizia from Dearness Gardens in Huntersville. It's the only other place I ever found it.
Yep, that's another place I would certainly recommend. There's a Habitat Steward up there named Christine. Help me out, Tara. Starts with Lazuski, who's very knowledgeable on plants, especially pollinator plants. She's a big butterfly person, so I would recommend that as well.
Yeah, I know most of the staff at Dearness, actually, because it's a mile from my house. Most of them have either gone through the Native Plant Society, the certifications and all that. So there's a wealth of resources in there. So they've helped me a lot really get started.
Yeah, they're good people. I went to Pikes when it opened in Matthews and said, what can you tell me about native plants? And they said, ooh, you don't want those. And I said, really? Why not? And they said, well, they just don't live in this area. And I went, okay.
Wow.
Yeah, exactly.
I went to the Pikes in Cornelius when it first opened, and I asked them if their plants were treated with neonicotinoids, and they had no idea what I was talking about. I'm like, okay, goodbye.
Yeah.
And I left.
Well, this Pikes and Matthews also told me those were very beneficial, and they had looked at research to prove it. I said, alrighty. So,
bye-bye now.
I think we do have one more question in the chat. Comments on the use of tropical milkweed and any problems.
Yeah, so that was probably, if we sat down and had wine or beer, we could debate that one for a while. Years ago, they used to say plant milkweed, just plant milkweed, and they didn't say anything at all about what kind of milkweed. And then we started seeing never plant anything other than what's native. So obviously by default, tropical is not native. And I think they're kind of squirting back toward it's okay to have some tropical now. So I'm probably not the person to ask that question. Lisa Tompkins, I know, believes it just plant milkweed. You do want to definitely have butterfly weed. And I like to have the common milkweed, although I will tell you, common milkweed is if you're living in a development with some stringent regulations, or if you're living in a retirement community, common milkweed can get 5 to 6 feet tall. It walks where it wants to go, so it will leave the side of your house and walk out into the yard if it wants to. And it's just kind of messy, and it doesn't look like anything a non-native gardener or a native gardener or non-native gardener is going to identify as a plant. They're going to think it's a weed. So that could be a problem. However, I sure did see a lot of monarchs munching on those weeds this year. And it was after I'd given up hope of all monarchs. And I just happened to pass, because I had dozens of plants, and I saw chewed leaves. And once I saw chewed leaves, I started looking at the other plants, and I found lots and lots of monarch larvae. So that was awesome.
Can I ask if anyone's had any experience with Vitex? Chase tree?
Mm-mm.
Okay, I have 2 of them, and I just learned that south of here they're considered invasive, but I've never had them grow on my property. I've never had them spread at all, so I was just trying to find out if anyone else had any experience with them, because the pollinators love them, but they're not native.
Well, keep in mind that it can take 100 years for a plant to show its invasive properties. So we used to think Bradford pears were a great thing, and now they've escaped and they've reverted back to the original form, which has wicked stickers, and they're growing all down 485 in the woods. So and crepe myrtles. I mean, I've got crepe myrtles in my yard. My yard was landscaped with crepe myrtles as a border between houses, and I see sprouts sticking up all the time from those. So yeah, I watched things carefully. We redid the whole ordinance for the town of Matthews, and we looked at all of the plant lists that developers can use and they can use in parks and on town property. We took out all of the known invasives. Nice. And then when we did research, we found out there was one tree, and it was some sort of an oak, and I'm not going to come up with this off the top of my head tonight, but it's not been identified as native in North Carolina. It has been identified as native or as invasive in all the states surrounding North Carolina. So odds are pretty good, I bet, that it will eventually be identified as invasive here.
Yeah, I actually tried planting some of the seeds when I first put them in before I discovered the wonder of natives and the habitat and everything. And nothing happened. So I and the 2 of them have been there, like, I think I'm going on 5 years.
Well, keep in mind that some seeds have to go through an animal's digestive system before they're viable too.
That's what's concerning me, because I just noticed my cardinals eating them, and I've never seen that happen before, eating the seed. So now I'm kind of worried that I'm about to get a bunch of cardinal poop, you know, throwing seeds all over the place. Thing is, I mean, they're gorgeous, and the pollinators love them, and so I just trying to find out if, because I know some cultivars are sterile. I was trying to find out if this particular cultivar was sterile, but I can't find it anywhere online.
Did you look on the Native Plant Society website or Facebook page?
I've been on there a few times. I haven't been there recently, and I might just pose it as a question in Facebook.
Yeah.
But I just figured while we were here, I thought maybe, you know, with all the people that can hear on here, if anyone else, you know, had any experience with these particular trees. I hate pulling down something that's beautiful and growing great and feeding pollinators if it's not going to be a problem.
Right. And call Lisa Tompkins and ask. She would not mind.
Oh yeah, Lisa's awesome. I didn't even think of that.
Yeah.
I think we had a question from Vicki Matlock as well. If you'd like to chime in, Vicki.
Yes, I wanted to confirm that that location, the church, Morningstar Lutheran, is off of Idlewild.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That's correct. Okay.
Yep. And it's a tiny little white clapboard building, and it's got an old cemetery with it.
Well, don't want to get me started about old cemetery, but
I know they just put in a pollinator garden with a Girl Scout group about 2 weeks ago. I have not seen that yet, but the meditation garden with the labyrinth is probably 3 years old at this point. And if you want to see another example of native plants used in the landscaping, come to Matthews and go to Stumptown Park and look at the Veterans Memorial that's just been completed. Lisa designed that as well, and it's a beautiful place.
Well, people, if it's not too far away, we've got the teaching garden down at Union County, right there at the Ag Building. So,
yep,
that would be a huge example.
And the UNCC has the Larry Mellichamp Terrace garden too, which is really nice.
Correct. The other thing I wanted to say is that the new Quest building up by the Raptor Center, Ladder Plantation, they are going to have a huge learning facility inside of Quest about water conservation, and that's Mecklenburg County.
Oh, nice. I had not heard that.
Yes, so it's that's going to be really cool when it gets done. And it'll be shared with the Ambassador Burge, you know, once they get that built out. So,
yeah, great.
And Vicki, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the Union County Master Gardeners also do a plant sale every year at the Ag Center.
It depends on whether we still have COVID going on or not.
Yeah. Wing Haven did have their sale last year. I don't know if they're planning on doing it again this year, but they did have their sale. You had to have an appointment to get in at a designated time. And the Union County Master Gardeners are awesome because I've worked with them on projects before, so I recommend them highly.
Yeah, and obviously I'm a master gardener, so I'm going to highly recommend Union County. So. And, you know, it's just COVID and rules and the county rules and everything else. I mean, everything's just tightened up again. What in on the world? So, oh my goodness,
I think we're just cutting out just a little bit, Vicki, but I think we mostly heard you there. I do see just one more question, I think. What advice can you give to gardeners that have shady lots from oaks as far as plant species that are attractive? And a recording of the webinar will be available and sent to you all afterwards.
Okay, so I love shade gardening. I have a fairly small backyard, and I would say 2/3 of it is in shade. And until I started piddling around with that space, I had never even considered things growing in the shade before. But gosh, you can have so many things grow in the shade, and some things will grow in either or, so you can look at that. But a lot of our ferns, Christmas ferns, for example, are used in my shade. I've got Spigalia, which is Indian pink. I have native Solomon seal. I've got some non-native varieties like hostas and Linton rose. What else? The cardinal flower would be in there. Green and gold, which is a ground cover that's awesome. It'll grow just about anywhere. So yeah, shade gardening will open up your whole world. It's just amazing. It's a different thing to think about. And let's face it, you can garden in the full sun during the summer, or you can garden in the shade during the summer. Not a bad choice.
Thanks, Debbie. And I think Karen Jacob has a question if you want to unmute.
There we go. We've planted some of these plants that came through for the butterfly highway, and they grow really tall. And then the next year they got even taller, and so they were like 8 or 9 feet tall. So should I cut them off? At least after they've all gone, should I cut them off and let them sort of start from the bottom again? I didn't want to kill them, but I mean, this year they may be 12 or 15 feet tall, and that's really higher than I really want for part of the yard. What are you dealing with, Joe Pye weed? No, it's not Joe Pye weed. It was something that was purple. I can't remember what it was. Ironweed? I mean, it's whatever they have in their little, when you get a little, I was given the people at Paws gave us one of those packets that okay, yeah. And well, I think the packets change contents depending on, what they get mixed up. Am I right, Tara? Yeah. So here's what I would do. Since I don't know exactly what you're talking about, what I would do is I would say, okay, I'm going to cut the ones down on the left to the ground level. But I would wait until probably November or December, and I'd probably leave what I cut on the ground because there could be things nesting in that. And then I'm going to leave the ones on the right and see what happens with them next year. Okay. Experiment. Keep data. Okay. Thank you. You're welcome.
Okay, I think that may be all the questions. I'll turn it back over to Brianna if she wants to add any last thoughts.
Sorry, of course, right then my computer froze. Debbie, thank you for doing this presentation for us this evening. It was really wonderful. I feel like I learned a lot, and I can't wait to take it back to our local area.
Good, thank you. Go forth and certify, all of you. Go forth and certify.